Hey everyone, it's Stephanie here with my February 2016 paper doll layout. This month I decided to base my layout off of a romantic comedy, mainly because it's Valentine's Day month, and I'm not going to lie, romantic comedies are one of my favorite types of movies. So this month my layout is based on the movie The Proposal. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp my dolls first. I'm using the downloadable dictionary paper that I shared in the last couple of videos, and I'm stamping my dolls directly on that with Tuxedo Memento black ink. I'm stamping both a girl and a boy doll, and then I'm going to stamp an additional girl head just because I don't want to use the one that comes on the actual doll. My stamp completely fell off my block here, as you can see, so I had to restamp her quickly. But luckily she didn't land on the boy or anything, so no problem. So I went ahead and stamped those, and now I'm going to go ahead, while I already have all my stamps out, and stamp all of the pieces for the clothes. So I just found some pattern papers that I like to, I'm kind of went with like a grayish brown color here for his suit, and then I'm going to stamp pieces of his suit jacket on this plaid paper, which is going to be his dress shirt, and then I'm also going to stamp it on a piece of black to do his tie. And then I always like to cut out the little pocket pieces and the lapels on his jacket just to give a little bit more dimension. So I stamped a second version of the jacket there to use to be able to cut up and cut those little pieces out. And then for her, I'm going to go ahead and stamp her onto some black paper. And then I'm also going to stamp her a second time on this pattern paper here. It's just kind of like a black with some gray pattern in it. And I'm going to use this for the little tie that she has around her waist. I did want to keep her mainly in black since that's what she wears in one of the main scenes in the movie at the beginning. And so I wanted to kind of keep true to that, but I wanted to add a little bit more detail so it didn't look so flat when I finished her. So I just added that there for some extra detail. So I'm going to go ahead and color in their skin with my Copic markers. For their skin, I like to use E00, E11, and E43. I don't use a ton of E43. It is a really darker color compared to the first two that I use, but it does give a nice bit of shading to make their skin look a little bit more realistic. So I went ahead first and colored all of her skin, and then I'm going to move on to his. With him, I only really have to worry about his face and his neck, and the little tiny piece of his hand, since you don't really see any of his arms or anything once we put the suit on him. And then I also colored the face on the second head that I stamped there, just because that's the head I'm going to be using on the doll. And don't be afraid to do that if you do these type of layouts, or if you experiment with paper dolls and you have a paper doll that you really like the body on it but you don't like the head that goes with it. You just kind of look to see what ones work together. They don't all work together because some of them are larger than others and some are smaller. But if you find dolls that are kind of similarly sized, you can definitely pick a different head and just kind of cut their heads off and replace it with another one. I know it sounds a little bit crazy to cut off their heads, but it definitely works, and it helps to really create a character that you're trying to create if the dolls that you have don't really work. So you'll see here that this works out perfectly, and you don't even really notice that it wasn't the head that originally came on the doll. So now I'm just going ahead and coloring in her hair. I went with darker colors of browns to make it look like her hair. And then I'm also coloring in the hair on the guy. His hair is kind of wild. It kind of sticks up a little far. So when I do end up cutting him out, I think I trimmed down a little bit of the hair on the top. I always kind of manipulate this doll to whatever I need. Since I have used him quite a bit, there isn't as many boy stamps as girls. So sometimes I have to repeatedly use this guy here. But he's been a lot of fun character, so it works out, no problem. And so now that I have all the dolls, they're colored, they're ready to go, it's time to cut out all of their clothes. So I just went ahead and I went off camera because it took a little bit of time to cut them all out, but I just trimmed out all of the clothes that I had already stamped. And now I'm going to go ahead and start to assemble the dolls. Now before I start with the girl, I do want to get the right head on her. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut her head out, and then I'm going to just glue it directly on top of the doll that's already on here. And you can see here it looks great. Like it looks like it was already part of that doll. And you're going to see the hair pieces of the doll underneath kind of sticking out, but it's not going to matter because we're going to completely cut this doll out, so you're not going to see any pieces on the outside area. Now before I could put her hair on, I am going to leave the hair overlaying her shoulder. I'm not going to tuck it behind her shoulder, so I needed to make sure that I had her dress on already so that the hair can sit on top. So I just went ahead and adhered the base of the dress, and then I also adhered the jacket separately. I used the same black that I used for the dress, but I did a second stamping and cut those out separately just to give a little bit more detail and dimension on her outfit. And then I also added her little shoes. I did stamp and cut those shoes out. I could have just colored them in with marker, but I wanted to give that dimension that the the pattern paper adds. So it was a little bit intricate to try and cut those little shoes out, especially that heel, but I did it. It worked out, and I'm kind of glad because I like the texture that it adds. And then you can see there I added her head on top, and now I'm moving on to Andrew and putting all of his clothes on. So I did his suit first. I always do his pants since they go kind of half up his stomach. And then I did his jacket, and now I'm just adding all the little details on top. So I put his plaid shirt on, his tie, and then I'm just adding all the little pieces that I mentioned earlier that I stamped separately to add on to give a little bit more dimension and detail onto his suit, especially because it is one solid color. And it looks pretty flat, but we will shade it a little bit later in the video, so it's definitely going to give it a lot more dimension. So now that I have all of the coloring done and the clothes are all on, I'm going to go ahead and cut the dolls out of the paper. I usually do the inside area of their arms and their legs first, and I didn't do it this time. I forgot. I did end up doing it off camera, but it is definitely harder to cut those inner areas out when the dolls are already cut out. So I definitely recommend doing the inner areas with your X-Acto knife first and then cutting the dolls out with scissors. So for the quote, I used one of the quotes in the end of the movie where he says, "So Margaret, marry me because I'd like to date you." If you've seen this movie, you kind of know that she's being deported and is forcing him to marry her, and they ended up falling in love, and they didn't get married because she did the right thing and left, and then he followed her back to New York to propose and tell her that he loved her. So I wanted to depict the scene that they were in New York, so I went ahead and added a window. I die cut this from the Madison Grand window from Memory Box. I just used a textured wood grain white paper to die cut that. And then I also cut the New York skyline from the New York skyline die from My Favorite Things, and I'm going to put that in behind the window to make it look like they're standing in their office in New York, and you can see New York in through the window on the outside. So I went ahead and added the quote to a wood grain piece of paper to mimic the floor, and then I'm just going to cut out a little strip of gray cardstock here to kind of separate the wall from the floor area, and I'm just going to adhere that right directly above the floor area, and then I'm going to go ahead and adhere the window on top. For the window area, I just trimmed down a piece of pattern paper that kind of had like an aqua color to it that kind of was ombre, so it looked like sky to me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that skyline piece and I'm going to adhere that onto the sky area before I assemble the window. And that's going to make it easy to just kind of adhere everything together before I put it onto the layout. So I just kind of eyeballed here to figure out where I wanted it, and I decided to just put it right against the bottom so that I knew everything would be lined up and straight. And I'm just using some regular adhesive to add that onto that piece of blue area. And you can see there with that ombre look, it just really looks like a cool sky. So I loved how that turned out. And this this skyline fit perfectly behind this window, so everything kind of was portioned the same size, so it worked out. I just love how this ended up working out. So I'm just adding some adhesive to the window, and I'm going to adhere that directly over this sky area that I've created, and then this is going to go directly on the wall beside them. So I'm just going to adhere this with regular adhesive. Now before I do that, I realized that I didn't do any of the shading on the dolls. I usually do this before I cut them out, but sometimes I just get so excited to get them all cut out and ready to go that I forget. So I went ahead with some warm gray markers for him. I usually use cool tone markers for my shading, but because he is wearing a gray toned suit that kind of has a more warm feel to it, I really thought that the gray tone or the warm tones would look a lot better in his shading. And his suit ends up looking so dimensional and looks so much better once the shading is done. So I definitely recommend, adding just a bit of shading to their clothes just because it adds so much more detail and dimension once you finish. So you can see there I did a bunch of shading around all of his pockets and his pants and stuff. And then when I finished him, even though she's wearing a pretty dark suit, you can definitely still add shading to her. I just use a very dark C7, I think, marker to add a bit of shading to her tie and then just some areas around her jacket and her skirt. And that definitely makes her look a lot more dimensional, especially because she's in one color. So once I have that done, I can go ahead and start to assemble the layout. So I'm putting him on first, and I'm making sure to put the bottom of his leg right off of the page, just because he has I've said it before, I'll say it again, he has a weird leg that doesn't really have a shoe, and it just kind of looks funny. So anytime I use him on my layouts, I always make sure to either hide the bottom of his leg or just cut it right off. So I did that with him first, and then I'm going to go ahead. You can see here I just ripped my window apart, and I did that because I had added some gray Copic marker to the window for shading, and I didn't like it. It didn't blend into that wood grain cardstock at all, and it just looked terrible. So I decided to forget the shading, and I die cut a second window and took off the original one and replaced it with the plain white one. And then I'm going to go ahead and I adhered the window on. I used my T-square ruler just to kind of make sure it was lined up and completely straight. And now I'm going to go ahead and adhere Margaret onto the layout as well. And I just kind of positioned her so that she was standing beside Andrew. And I wanted her in the forefront just because she is the more dominant role in the movie. And I just thought it would look better to have her kind of forward and him kind of standing behind her. And then just to add a little bit more detail to the layout, I took another gray Copic marker. This is a lighter C-toned marker. And I just went around the window area to add a bit of shading, just to make it look like it was kind of popping off the wall and not so flat. And then I also added a little bit of shading along the bottom edge of the gray strip that I added to separate the floor and the wall. And then once I finish that, I'm just going to add a little bit more detail to him and her by adding some jewelry to her. There's some great little jewelry accessories that you can get for these dolls. So I gave her a necklace and a bracelet. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of sparkle to her shoes with a Wink of Stella glitter pen and some detail to his buttons with a black gel pen. And that's going to complete the layout for this month. So thank you so much for joining me for this month's layout. I will be back next month with another paper doll layout based on a movie or TV show. Thanks so much for watching.